There is a document in the National Archives in Washington that most Americans have never read. It is a memo from the State Department dated mid-1941, and it contains a sentence that should chill anyone who studies the relationship between economic pressure and war. The sentence, paraphrased into plain language, says this: "We know the oil embargo will likely push Japan toward military action, but we believe the risk is manageable." It was not manageable. 6 months after that memo was written, the Japanese Navy crossed 4,000 miles of open ocean and destroyed the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 2,400 Americans died in 2 hours. The United States entered the bloodiest war in human history. And the chain of events that led to that Sunday morning in December began not with a declaration of war, not with a military provocation, but with a decision made in an office in Washington to turn off a valve, to cut the oil. That story is 85 years old, and it is happening again, right now, with different names and different geography, but identical logic, identical tools, and an ending that has not yet been written. The story has been told many times as a tale of military surprise and intelligence failure. But that framing misses the deeper truth. Pearl Harbor was not primarily an intelligence failure. The United States had excellent intelligence. It was reading Japan's mail. It knew war was coming. The failure was not in the intelligence, it was in the policy. The oil embargo created a set of conditions under which a rational actor, facing the choice between slow economic death and a high-risk military gamble, chose the gamble. The intelligence community saw the symptoms. The policy community had created the disease. Understanding this distinction is essential because the same distinction applies today. In February 2025, President Donald Trump signed National Security Presidential Memorandum 2, reimposing what the administration calls maximum pressure on Iran. The objective, stated explicitly in the document, is to drive Iran's oil exports to zero. The Treasury Department has sanctioned over 875 individuals, entities, vessels, and aircraft connected to Iranian petroleum sales. A shadow fleet of tankers that transport Iranian crude to China has been targeted. Chinese teapot refineries that process the oil have been designated. Front companies in the UAE, Turkey, and India have been blacklisted. The economic architecture is being dismantled piece by piece, and the stated goal is suffocation. The parallels between 1941 and 2025 are not metaphorical, they're structural. The same nation is using the same weapon against a different adversary for the same reason, to compel a country that depends on oil revenue to change its behavior without resorting to military force. The question that the men in the State Department asked in 1941 is the same question that the men in the Treasury Department are asking today. How much pressure can you apply before the target breaks? And when it breaks, which direction does it fall? This is not a story about whether the embargo is justified. Both the 1941 embargo on Japan and the current sanctions on Iran have legitimate strategic rationales. Japan was committing atrocities in China and expanding aggressively across Southeast Asia. Iran is enriching uranium, funding proxy militias across the Middle East, and developing ballistic missiles that its neighbors consider an existential threat. The question is not whether the pressure is deserved. The question is whether the tool works the way its users think it does. Because in 1941, it did not. To understand why the United States had the power to cut off Japan's oil, you need to understand a fact about the 1930s that most people find astonishing. In 1940, the United States produced roughly 63% of the world's oil. Not the Middle East, not Russia, America. The oil fields of Texas, California, Oklahoma, and Louisiana pumped more crude petroleum than the rest of the planet combined. The United States was not just a major oil producer, it was the dominant global supplier, the Saudi Arabia of its era, and it used that dominance the way any nation with a monopoly uses it, as leverage. The Texas Railroad Commission regulated production quotas that effectively set the world oil price. American oil companies operated globally. The levers of the petroleum world were in American hands, and when those hands decided to close the valve, the consequences traveled around the globe at the speed of a diplomatic cable. Japan had almost no oil of its own. The Japanese home island sat on top of negligible petroleum reserves. The entire Japanese war machine, every warship, every aircraft, every tank, every truck that supported the invasion of China ran on imported oil. And more than 80% of that imported oil came from one country, the United States. This was not a secret. Japanese war planners knew their dependency was their greatest vulnerability. They had been trying to reduce it for years, stockpiling reserves, developing synthetic fuel programs, and eyeing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, which produced enough crude to potentially replace American supplies. But the stockpile was finite, the synthetic programs were inadequate, and the Dutch East Indies were controlled by a European colonial power that was aligned with Britain and the United States. Japan had tried to negotiate increased oil deliveries from the Dutch East Indies in the autumn of 1940. The Japanese demanded 3.15 million barrels. The Dutch offered 1.35 million, less than half. The negotiations collapsed. The Dutch, though their homeland was under German occupation, refused to become Japan's alternative gas station. Their colonial administrators in Batavia understood that yielding to Japanese pressure would simply transfer dependency from one imperial power to another. This left Japan in a trap of its own making. Its military expansion in China and Southeast Asia had made it an international pariah. Its alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy had isolated it diplomatically, and its dependence on American oil meant that the one country most opposed to its actions was also the one country it could not survive without. It was, as one historian described it, like a man holding a gun to his own head and demanding that someone else pull the trigger. The parallel with modern Iran is striking, but inverted. Iran is not an oil importer, it is an oil exporter. Iran sits on the fourth largest proven oil reserves in the world and the second largest natural gas reserves. But oil exports are the lifeblood of the Iranian economy, generating the revenue that funds the government, the military, and the vast network of regional proxies that project Iranian power across the Middle East. Cut the oil revenue, and the Iranian state begins to suffocate, just as Japan's military began to suffocate when its oil imports were cut. The mechanism is the same. The direction of flow is reversed. Japan needed oil to flow in. Iran needs oil revenue to flow out. In both cases, the United States holds the valve. The American oil embargo against Japan did not arrive suddenly. It escalated in stages over 2 years, each step calibrated to increase pressure without provoking war. In July 1938, the State Department issued a moral embargo on the export of aircraft and aircraft parts to countries that bombed civilian populations. Japan was the obvious target. In December 1939, the moral embargo was extended to materials for building airplanes, including molybdenum, aluminum, and nickel. In July 1940, Roosevelt restricted export licenses for iron, scrap steel, lubricating oil, and aviation gasoline. Each step was a signal. Each signal was calibrated to say, "We disapprove of your actions, and we are prepared to increase the cost." But each step also left an escape route. Japan could still buy non-aviation petroleum products. It could still access American markets for many critical materials. The door was closing, but it was not yet shut. The Japanese understood the signals. They tried to negotiate. In early 1941, a new ambassador, Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura, known to be sympathetic to the United States, was sent to Washington with proposals that included a freeze on further Japanese military expansion and a promise to negotiate peace with China. In return, Japan asked for a resumption of normal trade relations and an end to the embargoes. The proposals were earnest but insufficient from the American perspective. The negotiations dragged on through the spring and summer of 1941, with neither side willing to make the concessions the other demanded. During this entire period, from the first moral embargo in 1938 to the full freeze in July 1941, the Roosevelt administration was reading Japanese diplomatic communications through the Purple Code. They knew what Japan's negotiating positions were before the Japanese ambassador delivered them. They knew the internal debates. They knew the deadlines the military was imposing on the diplomatic process. And they knew that each escalation of economic pressure was narrowing the space for diplomatic resolution. The pattern is identical in the Iran case. Sanctions against Iran have been escalating for over 4 decades, beginning after the 1979 revolution and the hostage crisis. The Obama administration tightened them dramatically between 2010 and 2015, targeting Iran's oil exports and banking system. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, lifted many sanctions in exchange for limits on Iran's nuclear program. Trump's first administration withdrew from the deal in 2018 and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions. The Biden administration enforced them loosely, allowing Iranian oil exports to China to rise to record levels. And now Trump's second administration has returned to maximum pressure with even greater intensity. Each step has been a signal. Each has left a theoretical escape route. Negotiate a new nuclear agreement and the sanctions can be lifted. But with each tightening, the escape route narrows, and the target, whether Japan in 1941 or Iran in 2025, faces an increasingly binary choice: submit to the demands or find another way.
The critical moment in 1941 came on July 26 when Roosevelt signed an executive order freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. The order was intended to give the administration control over Japanese purchases of American oil. It was not, at least in Roosevelt's mind, a total embargo. The president wanted to allow some oil sales to continue, maintaining leverage while avoiding a complete rupture. But the implementation went further than the president intended. The bureaucrats responsible for administering the freeze interpreted it as a total ban. Dean Acheson, then an assistant secretary of state who would later become one of the architects of the Cold War, was among those who processed the license applications. Years later, Acheson acknowledged with remarkable candor that the working-level officials simply denied every Japanese application for oil purchases. No exceptions were made. No partial shipments were approved. The graduated pressure that Roosevelt had envisioned was replaced by a binary cutoff that left no room for calibration. This is a pattern that repeats in the history of sanctions. The political leadership designs a policy with nuance and flexibility. The bureaucracy implements it with maximum rigidity. The target experiences the rigid version, not the nuanced one. And the rigid version leaves no space for the diplomatic maneuvering that the political leadership was counting on. In the Iran case, a similar dynamic may be at work. NSPM-2 directs the Treasury Department to drive Iran's oil exports to zero. Zero is not a number that leaves room for calibration. Zero is a binary. It is the 1941 total freeze translated into 2025 language. And the Treasury Department, which has sanctioned over 875 targets in its first year of maximum pressure, appears to be implementing the directive with the same comprehensive rigor that Acheson's team brought to the Japanese asset freeze. No oil flowed. The partial squeeze became a complete cutoff. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed the American lead within days. In one stroke, Japan lost access to 94% of its oil supply. The Navy had 18 months of fuel at peacetime consumption rates.
In wartime, that number dropped to less than a year. The clock started ticking. The Iranian parallel is not a single dramatic moment, but a grinding escalation. In 2025, the Treasury Department sanctioned the shadow fleet of tankers that carry Iranian crude to China. In 2026, Trump signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on nations that import Iranian oil, a secondary sanction aimed directly at China, which purchases virtually all of Iran's crude exports. The Shandong Port Group, which oversees the ports where most Iranian tankers docked, announced it would refuse entry to sanctioned vessels. Iranian oil exports to China, which had averaged 1.5 million barrels per day in 2024, began declining. The Iranian rial lost 75% of its value in a single year. Capital flight accelerated. Liquidity in the Iranian banking system expanded by over 40% as the government printed money to compensate for lost oil revenue. The clock is ticking for Iran, too. Not as dramatically as it ticked for Japan, because Iran is not consuming a finite stockpile. But the revenue is declining, the currency is collapsing, and the government's ability to fund its operations, both domestic and regional, is eroding month by month. What happened next in 1941 is the part of the story that should keep policymakers awake at night. The Japanese government, facing a choice between capitulation and war, chose war. The decision was not irrational, though it is often portrayed that way. The Japanese military leadership calculated that time was working against them. Every month that passed without oil imports weakened their forces relative to the United States, which was rearming at a pace that would make American military power overwhelming within 2 years. If Japan was going to fight, it was better to fight now, while the Navy still had fuel and the American Pacific Fleet was concentrated in one place. The plan was to strike Pearl Harbor, cripple the Pacific Fleet, and then seize the Dutch East Indies for their oil. The seizure of the oil fields would break the dependency on American imports and give Japan the resources to sustain a long war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not an end in itself, it was a means to an end, securing the oil that the embargo had denied. Ambassador Joseph Grew, the American envoy in Tokyo, had warned repeatedly that if pushed to the wall, the Japanese would react violently and without warning. His cables were read, noted, and filed. The Purple Code intercepts, which allowed American intelligence to read Japanese diplomatic communications in near real time, confirmed that Japan was preparing for war. The cryptographic breakthrough had been achieved by William Friedman and his team in the Army Signal Corps, who had cracked the Japanese diplomatic cipher machine. Every message from Tokyo to its embassies in Washington, Berlin, and other capitals was being read by the Secretary of State, often within hours of transmission. Roosevelt and his advisors knew. They knew the embargo was pushing Japan toward military action. They knew the Japanese were setting deadlines for diplomacy. They knew that the failure of diplomacy would mean war. Yet they persisted with the embargo. They did not soften the terms, they did not offer a partial lifting of sanctions in exchange for partial Japanese concessions. When the Japanese proposed a modus vivendi, a temporary arrangement that would have provided limited oil in exchange for a partial withdrawal from Indochina, Secretary of State Cordell Hull rejected it and instead delivered the Hull Note on November 26th, demanding complete Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina. The Japanese received the note as an ultimatum. The fleet had already sailed for Pearl Harbor. They believed, based on intelligence assessments, that Japan would strike south against Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, not east against Hawaii. They were wrong. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,403 Americans, destroyed or damaged 8 battleships and nearly 200 aircraft, and drew the United States into a war that would last 4 years and cost over 400,000 American lives. The oil embargo that was supposed to restrain Japan had instead unleashed it. The irony is bottomless.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor achieved the one thing that no amount of Japanese aggression in China had been able to accomplish. It unified the American public behind a war that most Americans had been desperate to avoid. Before December 7th, Roosevelt could not have obtained a declaration of war from Congress against Japan. After December 7th, the vote was 82-0 in the Senate and 388-1 in the House. The embargo, which was meant to avoid war, had produced the most devastating surprise attack in American history, which in turn produced the total mobilization that would eventually destroy the Japanese Empire. Japan did seize the Dutch East Indies oil fields exactly as its war planners had intended. By early 1942, Japanese forces controlled the Borneo oil fields at Balikpapan and Tarakan, the Sumatran fields at Palembang, and the Java fields that had fueled the colonial economy. For a brief period, Japan had the oil it needed. But the seizure came at the cost of a war with the United States, Britain, Australia, and the Netherlands simultaneously, a war that Japan could not win and that its own senior officers knew it could not win. Admiral Yamamoto's famous prediction proved accurate. Japan ran wild for 6 months, from Pearl Harbor to Midway, and then the tide turned irreversibly. The question that haunts every historian of the Pacific War is whether there was an alternative. Could the United States have maintained pressure on Japan without triggering war? Could a partial embargo, carefully managed, have achieved the strategic objective of halting Japanese expansion without provoking the desperate gamble of Pearl Harbor? The answer is probably yes, but only if the implementation had matched the intention. Roosevelt wanted a graduated squeeze, not a sudden cutoff. The total freeze that Acheson and his colleagues implemented was more extreme than the president had authorized. It left Japan with no middle ground, no room to negotiate, no face-saving exit. The embargo was a binary switch: total compliance with American demands, including withdrawal from China, or total economic isolation. For the Japanese military leadership, those terms were equivalent to surrender without a fight. This is the critical lesson for the Iran situation. The effectiveness of economic pressure depends not just on the pressure itself, but on the exit ramp. If the target sees a path to relief, one that it can take without losing everything, it may take it. If the target sees only 2 options, capitulation or escalation, it may choose escalation. Iran in 2026 faces a set of options that are narrowing in ways that echo 1941. The nuclear talks in Geneva have produced limited results. The American demand for zero uranium enrichment contradicts Iran's insistence on its right to peaceful nuclear technology. The Iranian foreign minister has said publicly that Iran will never develop a nuclear weapon, but has rejected the terms the United States is offering. Meanwhile, the United States has moved 2 aircraft carriers into the region, bombed Iranian nuclear facilities in June 2025 as part of Israel's campaign, and continued to tighten the economic vice. Iran is not Japan. It does not have a navy capable of striking American territory. It does not have the industrial base to wage conventional war against the United States. But it has other options that Japan did not. Proxy forces across the Middle East, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, who have demonstrated the ability to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea, a ballistic missile program with ranges exceeding 2,000 kilometers, a nuclear enrichment capability that could produce weapons-grade uranium within weeks if the political decision were made, and the ability to disrupt oil shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 21 million barrels per day pass, approximately 20% of the world's oil supply. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's ace in the hole, the one card it can play that would inflict immediate global economic pain. A closure of the strait, even a partial one through mining or missile attacks on tankers, would spike oil prices overnight and send shockwaves through every economy on the planet. Iran has rehearsed this scenario repeatedly. Its Navy and Revolutionary Guard Corps conduct exercises in the strait regularly. The threat is credible,
and it is the Iranian equivalent of Japan's decision to strike south, a desperate option that becomes less desperate as the alternatives disappear. The embargo playbook assumes that economic pain will eventually force the target to the negotiating table. But the 1941 precedent shows that when the pain becomes existential, the target may choose a different table entirely. There is a deeper structural similarity between the two cases that goes beyond the mechanics of oil embargoes. It is about the psychology of decision-making under extreme pressure. In 1941, the Japanese government operated through a system of consensus called liaison conferences, in which civilian ministers and military commanders negotiated policy. The system was designed to produce agreement, but under the pressure of the embargo, it became a machine for escalation. The moderates, led by Prime Minister Prince Konoe, argued for continued negotiation. The hardliners, led by War Minister Hideki Tojo, argued that every day of delay weakened Japan's military position. When Konoe failed to secure a diplomatic breakthrough, he resigned in October 1941. Tojo replaced him. Within weeks, the decision for war was made. The dynamic is familiar. Economic pressure empowers hardliners by validating their narrative. The embargo did not persuade Japanese moderates that their country should change course. It persuaded Japanese militarists that their country was under attack and that only force could break the siege. The tool that was meant to strengthen the hand of diplomacy ended up destroying it. Iran's internal politics are different in structure, but similar in dynamic. The reformist faction, which supported the nuclear deal in 2015, has been progressively marginalized. The hardliners, centered in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, have gained power as external pressure has increased. The IRGC controls vast economic interests within Iran, including construction, telecommunications, and much of the oil trade itself. Sanctions that target the Iranian economy often strengthen the IRGC's hand because the organization controls the smuggling networks and shadow economy that profit from sanctions evasion. The more the formal economy is strangled, the more the informal economy, which the IRGC dominates, becomes the only game in town. The argument that negotiation with the West is futile, that the Americans will never lift sanctions regardless of what Iran agrees to, has been strengthened by the cycle of deal-making and deal-breaking that has characterized the relationship since 2015. Iran negotiated the JCPOA in good faith, complied with its terms according to international inspectors, and then watched the United States unilaterally withdraw from the agreement and reimpose sanctions. That experience hardened Iranian skepticism about the value of negotiation to a degree that may be irreversible. Maximum pressure, which is designed to compel concessions, may instead be eliminating the domestic constituencies that would deliver them. The oil itself tells a story. In 1941, Japan's oil reserves stood at approximately 43 million barrels when the embargo hit. At peacetime naval consumption rates, that was 18 months of supply. At wartime rates, it was less than a year. The planning board director, Suzuki, told the leadership that the synthetic fuel industry was inadequate for any near-term war effort. The Navy, which consumed 88% of Japan's refined fuel, calculated that it had to act within months or accept permanent strategic inferiority. The numbers created their own logic. Once the stockpile began to deplete, every day that passed without action was a day that action became more difficult. The embargo did not just restrict supply, it imposed a deadline, and deadlines, in the minds of military planners, demand decisions. Iran's oil arithmetic is different, but no less consequential. Iran exported an average of 1.38 million barrels per day of crude to China in 2025, down 7% from 2024. Its petroleum product exports fell 13%. The rial collapsed, losing roughly 75% of its value in a single year. Capital flight reached record levels as businesses and elites moved assets abroad. The central bank's figures show that oil revenues fell about 10% in the first half of the Iranian fiscal year, even before accounting for the deep discounts Iran offers Chinese buyers, purportedly $10 to $11 per barrel below benchmark prices. Liquidity in the Iranian banking system expanded by over 40% as the government printed money to compensate, fueling inflation that devastated ordinary Iranians. And then came the protests. In late 2025 and into 2026, Iranian citizens took to the streets in numbers that rivaled or exceeded the 2022 movement. The government shut down internet access across the country to conceal the scale of its crackdown. The Treasury Department responded with additional sanctions on the shadow fleet, citing the regime's killing of peaceful protesters. The economic pressure and the domestic unrest are feeding each other in a spiral that is accelerating month by month. But Iran's shadow fleet is being hunted. In 2025, the Treasury sanctioned 84% of the tankers involved in lifting Iranian crude. The remaining unsanctioned vessels are dwindling. China, facing the threat of 25% tariffs on over $400 billion of annual exports to the United States, is unlikely to ignore the pressure indefinitely. Chinese refiners are already replacing Iranian crude with increased Russian supply, which comes without the sanctions risk. The one-for-one substitution is visible in the data. As Iranian deliveries to China declined in early 2026, Russian oil deliveries increased by almost exactly the same amount, roughly 370,000 barrels per day. The Chinese teapot refineries, small independent operations in Shandong province that have been the primary processors of Iranian crude, are the weakest link in the chain. These refineries are not connected to the American financial system, which makes them hard to sanction directly. But they depend on the Chinese domestic economy and the Chinese government, which is managing its own complex relationship with Washington, has shown a willingness to quietly reduce their access to Iranian crude when American pressure becomes intense enough. Iran knows this. Tehran can see the numbers as clearly as Washington can. Iran is reportedly offering discounts of $10 to $11 per barrel on its light crude to Chinese buyers, roughly 16% below the benchmark price. It is essentially paying China to keep buying. But even with the discounts, volume is declining. The shadow fleet is shrinking. And the alternative buyers, Syria, whose imports halted after the fall of Assad in late 2024, are gone. The vice is closing. Not as suddenly as it closed on Japan in July 1941, but with the same mechanical inevitability. The most dangerous parallel between 1941 and today is not the embargo itself. It is the assumption behind it. In 1941, the Roosevelt administration assumed that Japan would not attack the United States directly. The consensus among the president's advisors was that if Japan struck, it would be against British Malaya or the Dutch East Indies, targets that would give Japan the oil it needed without provoking a full American military response. The assumption was based on a rational calculation of Japanese interests. Why would Japan attack the one power whose industrial capacity could crush it? The assumption was logical. It was also wrong. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor not because it was rational in the conventional sense, but because the embargo had compressed the decision space to a point where the irrational became, in the eyes of the Japanese military, the least bad option. Doing nothing meant slow death. Attacking south without neutralizing the Pacific Fleet meant fighting with an enemy fleet on your flank. Attacking Pearl Harbor was a desperate gamble, but it was a gamble that offered at least a possibility of success. The assumption behind the current maximum pressure campaign is similar. Iran will not do anything truly drastic because the consequences would be catastrophic. Iran will not close the Strait of Hormuz because it would devastate its own economy along with everyone else's. Iran will not weaponize its nuclear program because it would invite devastating military retaliation. Iran will not launch a regional war because it cannot win one. Each of these assumptions is probably correct in isolation, but the 1941 precedent demonstrates that when all the reasonable options have been eliminated, unreasonable ones become thinkable. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was, by any rational assessment, a strategic catastrophe for Japan. It guaranteed the entry of the United States into the war and the eventual destruction of the Japanese Empire. Every senior Japanese naval officer, including Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the attack, knew this. Yamamoto had spent years in the United States. He had attended Harvard University. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had visited the oil fields of Texas and the automobile factories of Detroit. He understood American industrial capacity better than any other Japanese officer, and he was under no illusions about what a prolonged war would mean. He is reported to have told his colleagues that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in a favorable outcome. He was not optimistic about the attack he was planning. He was desperate. The embargo had made every other option worse. Yamamoto planned the attack anyway because the alternative, slow strangulation by the embargo, was worse. It was not a calculation of victory, it was a calculation of least worst outcomes, a choice between certain slow death and improbable sudden survival. Japan chose the improbable, and for 6 months, from Pearl Harbor through the fall of Singapore, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, and the sweep across the Pacific, the improbable seemed to be working. Japan had its oil. Japan had its empire. And then Midway happened, and the improbable became the impossible. And the next 3 years were a grinding campaign of attrition that ended with 2 atomic bombs and unconditional surrender. There is one more parallel that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable one. In 1941, the American public was overwhelmingly opposed to entering the war. Roosevelt had won re-election in 1940 on a promise to keep America out of foreign conflicts. The oil embargo was popular because it appeared to be a middle path between inaction and war. Punish Japanese aggression without sending American boys to fight. The public supported the embargo precisely because they believed it was an alternative to war. The embargo was not an alternative to war. It was a precursor to it. The economic pressure that was supposed to prevent military conflict instead made it inevitable. And when war came, the same public that had supported the embargo was shocked and outraged, not at the policy that had provoked the attack, but at the attack itself. Today, the maximum pressure campaign against Iran is presented in similar terms. It is economic warfare as an alternative to military warfare. It is sanctions instead of soldiers. It is the Treasury Department instead of the Defense Department. The American public, to the extent it pays attention, supports the pressure because it appears to be a way of addressing the Iranian threat without the cost and risk of military action. But the 2 aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf are not there for decoration. The United States bombed Iranian nuclear facilities in June 2025, the most significant direct American military action against Iran since the tanker wars of the 1980s. Those strikes destroyed centrifuge halls and enrichment equipment, but did not destroy Iran's technical knowledge or its determination to continue. The military buildup in the region is not a bluff. The economic pressure and the military pressure are parts of the same system, and if the economic pressure fails to produce the desired result, the military option is not theoretical, it is operational. The lesson of 1941 is not that oil embargoes always lead to war. It is that oil embargoes are not the surgical, bloodless tools that their proponents imagine them to be. They are acts of economic warfare that impose existential pressure on their targets, and targets under existential pressure do not always behave rationally, do not always calculate their interests the way the imposing power expects, and do not always choose the option that minimizes casualties. Japan chose Pearl Harbor. The attack was a catastrophic miscalculation that led to the destruction of the Japanese Empire, the deaths of millions of people across the Pacific, and the nuclear bombing of 2 Japanese cities. The oil embargo did not cause those outcomes in a simple linear way, But it set in motion a chain of events that no one in Washington had predicted and no one in Tokyo had wanted. The question today is not whether the maximum pressure campaign against Iran is justified. Reasonable people can disagree about that. The question is whether the policymakers who are implementing it have absorbed the lesson of 1941, whether they understand that an embargo is not a pause button on a conflict, but an accelerant, whether they have planned for the possibility that Iran, like Japan, may choose a path that the models and the memos and the intelligence assessments say it should not choose. Because the men who wrote the State Department memo in 1941 also thought the risk was manageable. They were the best-informed people in the most powerful country on earth with access to the enemy's own communications, and they were wrong. The valve is being turned. The oil is being cut. The pressure is building. The clock is ticking. And somewhere in Tehran, as in Tokyo 85 years ago, men are sitting in a room looking at charts that showed declining reserves and collapsing revenues, calculating how many months they have before the numbers make the decision for them. They are asking themselves the same question that Tojo and Yamamoto asked in the autumn of 1941. Not whether to fight, but whether waiting makes fighting harder. The regional dynamics add complexity that 1941 did not have. Turkey, Iran's neighbor and a NATO member, has bilateral trade with Iran worth roughly $10 billion and depends on Iranian natural gas under a pipeline agreement set to expire in mid-2026. Turkey has consistently opposed American sanctions on Iran, arguing they harm regional trade and ordinary citizens more than decision-makers in Tehran. Russia, which is itself under Western sanctions and has its own complicated relationship with Iran, has reportedly been mediating between Iran and Israel to prevent further escalation. The geopolitical web is denser than anything the Pacific War produced. But the fundamental dynamic is the same. A powerful nation is squeezing a weaker nation's economic lifeline, betting that the pain will produce compliance. The weaker nation is watching its options narrow. The clock is ticking, and the men making the decisions on both sides are operating with the same mix of intelligence, miscalculation, and institutional momentum that characterized the decisions of 1941. The playbook is the same, the tool is the same, the assumption is the same, that the target will bend before it breaks. History suggests otherwise. The playbook works until it does not, and when it stops working, it stops all at once.